Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Reid, Neilson. I'll be speaking on the experiences of early Latter-day Saint missionary Hosea Stout, who spent some time here in St. George later in life. I want to begin by thanking several individuals that are here today. First, Charlotte, for all of your work and organization and keeping your Juanita Brooks, your great-grandmother's legacy alive. It's a wonderful thing. She's been a hero or heroine of so many of us in the Latter-day Saint historical community and here in southern Utah for sure. I'm also grateful for Lyman Hafen and his goodness. Years ago, he wrote a foreword to a book I did on Zion National Park, and I've always been grateful for his kindness to both me personally and to my extended family. He was a dear friend of my grandmother, Montreux Larkin, and I was delighted this morning to see a number of Montreux's children, my aunts and uncles, and even a cousin today here, which makes me very, very happy. My mother, Catherine Larkin Neilson, grew up here in St. George, and so for all of my growing up years, we came to St. George. I was always a bit confused, as I've joked with others, why we came in the summertime. And my dad would say, well, that's when I got work off, and so that's when we went. And so I still remember going up to the little markets up on the boulevard and so many other places, playing in the ditches on Flood Street, and just having a great time here in the heat, for sure. Juanita Brooks, as a historian, worked on a number of important pioneer diaries, including the diaries of John D. Lee, of course, associated with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but also Hosea Stout, which many historians, including Dale Morgan, have labeled as some of the most important written in the American West and certainly of the Latter-day Saint experience. And I'm going to be speaking about Hosea Stout's diary specifically when he was called by President Brigham Young of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to be a missionary in China. And that ended up being Hong Kong. That's as far as any of them got. But in 1964, the University of Utah Press, in association with the Utah State Historical Society, published the diaries of Hosea Stout. And I'm currently in the process of preparing, they're actually prepared, just being finalized right now, that China portion from August 1852, when Hosea Stout received his mission call, to his return here to Utah in December, a year later, 1853, excuse me. The University of Nebraska Press is preparing that new edition for publication. I'm grateful also to see my friend Richard Saunders here, who's been very helpful in terms of helping me appreciate the relationship that he may be touching on today, of Juanita Brooks and Dale Morgan. Dale Morgan, of course, was the one that really helped with the initial transcription of the Hosea Stout diaries, and then gave the project to Juanita, who did it through the Utah State Historical Society. I've titled my remarks, "The Worlds of Hosea Stout, Pioneer Utah, Gold Rush California, and British Hong Kong." This is part of my front matter, or introductory materials to my larger book project, The Mid-19th Century Worlds of Latter-day Saint Missionary Hosea Stout. Today, because of time, I just want to focus on one of those worlds. 2 years ago, I was able to talk about the Frontier California piece and what it was like for Hosea Stout and his two missionary companions, James Lewis and Chapman Duncan. They had a fourth who became sick and could not continue on. What it was like for them to pass through the pioneer town of Parowan here in the fall of 1852 and make their way down, largely following what was known as the southern route, largely mirrors I-15 today, all the way through San Bernardino and out to the port city of San Pedro there in California. From there, they took steamer up the coast of California to San Francisco, where they arrived in January 1853. And so what I'd like to do today is just focus on the last piece, a little bit of what it was like in Gold Rush, California, as they interacted with Chinese residents there, but then also what it was like being in British Hong Kong, where I just returned from 3 weeks ago. I had the opportunity to be on a history trip there and to try and seek out as many locations as possible of Hosea Stout's missionary experience. So I'm going to pick it up on that the San Francisco leg and try and get us through Hong Kong in the time that I have allotted today. Hosea Stout and his fellow China-bound missionaries remained in San Francisco nearly 2 months preparing and fundraising for the passage to Hong Kong. They would be the final group of several Pacific Frontier Basin-bound missionaries to begin their Pacific voyage to their missionary assignments. Compared to San Bernardino, California, there was not a strong Latter-day Saint presence in the Bay Area at this time, but many church members contributed liberally to their fundraising for ship passage to Asia. Again, they were traveling according to the New Testament model, traveling without purse or scrip, and therefore they were reliant on the liberal donations of friends of the Latter-day Saints. The Saints had arrived in San Francisco in 1846 on board the Brooklyn and helped build up the town, but many of them left in 1848 for Utah, just as the California gold rush began. However, beginning in 1849, tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants arrived in San Francisco to work in the gold mines and elsewhere, inhabiting the communities that had previously been home to many Latter-day Saints. In fact, today, if you go to Chinatown in San Francisco, there's notes in some of the plaques there that these used to be what they called the Mormon area, or the original Mormon settlement, where China is today in San Francisco. 20,000 Chinese arrived in 1852 alone, and nearly 16,000 arrived just a few later in 1864, so there was a large population. While waiting in San Francisco, the Latter-day Saint missionaries tried to learn more about the Chinese people and their language, culture, and religion in preparation for their missionary activities there among the Chinese. What one wrote, James Lewis, of these Chinese immigrants and their growing Chinatown in San Francisco, to a leader, George A. Smith, in Utah, he said the following: "In California, there are about 75,000 Chinamen, generally in San Francisco and in the mines. They are best called the cooks, washers, and servants of that country. They are capable of performing and enduring more labor and fatigue than any other people in that land. They have no spirit to retaliate for the many insults and injuries they receive." And what was fascinating to me, being in Hong Kong just a few weeks ago, at the Hong Kong Museum of History, there's an incredible exhibit, one of the best I've seen, of what it was like for that trans-Pacific trade of the people from China, particularly the Canton area down by Hong Kong, to go to San Francisco by ship. It was like a regular, several ships a week took Chinese immigrants, labor specifically, from China to San Francisco, where they were hired. But talking about how difficult it was for these Chinese immigrants and their families, and the abuse and the difficult time they had in America. Despite their different culture and lifestyles, the Latter-day Saint elders found the Chinese people to be intelligent and morally advanced. Finally, on March 9th, 1853, weeks after all the other missionaries had departed for places like Hawaii and Tahiti, Hosea Stout and his companions boarded the John von Horn, a Dutch bark, and began their trans-Pacific voyage to Hong Kong. After about 50 days at sea, the Latter-day Saint missionary ship entered the Victoria Harbor, and it was so fun to imagine from Victoria Peak what it must have been like to have come into that harbor, which separates Hong Kong Island from the Kowloon Peninsula on the South China Sea. The city was scarcely a decade old, having been established in 1841 by Great Britain as a strategically located overseas colony following the Opium War. For decades, China had been the main supplier of tea to British consumers, which created an unsustainable trade deficit. The British determined to offset this imbalance to commerce by exporting addictive opium to the Chinese, which they produced by the poppies they created in their fields in India. The Chinese then countered the devastating effects of the opium trade by destroying the British stores and inventory there in Canton. This conflict led the British establishing Hong Kong as an offshore colony, which would provide a strategic location to continue to oversee military and economic activities there in the region. Finally, in June 1843, the Chinese government allowed foreigners to engage in open trade at 5 of their ports on the coastline of the South China Sea, and relinquished control of Hong Kong to the British, which would remain in their possession until 1997. Something that struck me when I was there recently is that it's been over a quarter of a century since British relinquished control of Hong Kong, and you can see how it's becoming more and more Chinese and less British today. The Latter-day Saint missionaries arrived in East Asia during the challenging era for Western Christians and their religious enthusiasm. Quote, "We landed at Hong Kong on the 20th of April, having arrived in the harbor the day before," James Lewis wrote of their arrival in East Asia. "After considerable search, we found a room to occupy which had formerly been used for stowing treasure, double barred in bolts, with privilege of eating with the owner at the rate of $1 a day each. This being our only chance, our luggage was moved ashore. The elders were struck by the foreignness of their new environment. Hosea Stout described to Brigham Young their tenuous situation as foreigners in China, quote, "We are strangers in a strange land where darkness covers the earth and gross darkness the people. Here we find a people situated differently from others we have seen and less likely to receive the gospel," or the message of the LDS Church. The missionaries also noted the military presence of British soldiers in Victoria, the de facto capital of Hong Kong during the British colonial period. Quote, "Here are quartered about 1,000 or 1,200 troops of the lowest order of English regiments made up of Irish and Scotch, though mostly Irish, with a regiment from the island of Ceylon, or modern-day Sri Lanka. Owing to the heat of the climate, they are only allowed out of the barracks in the evening from 6 to 8 o'clock, when they throng the places of prostitution, made so easily of access by license of the authority," Lewis described in the letter. The elders were quite stunned at some of the moral climate there. "The city of Hong Kong probably has 10,000 inhabitants of a motley mixture of all nations," James Lewis continued. "There are about 250 English aside from the troops stationed here. They are aristocrat nabobs from India who reside in that country to make a fortune and retire from business as soon as this is accomplished." Soon they found lodging in complimentary rooms at the Canton Bazaar in Victoria, where they hired a Chinese servant or steward to help with their domestic duties. Now, why did I talk about the political situation earlier? It's important because Stout and his companions arrived in Hong Kong during the Taiping Rebellion, a Chinese civil war that lasted from 1850 until 1964 on mainland China. The conflict originated with a Chinese man named Hong, who had read some tracts left by a Christian missionary and had a vision that led him to believe he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Hong established a religious community that forbade opium and alcohol and that pooled all resources into a community fund. He and his followers, known as God worshippers, spread throughout southeast China, preaching their unique form of Christianity, combating Confucian ideas, and seeking to overthrow the Qing dynasty. Western societies initially favored the idea of a Christian group overthrowing the traditional Chinese traditions, but they soon became less enthusiastic when they observed the eccentricities of the Taiping group. The Taiping Rebellion finally ended in 1864 with the death of Hong. In a letter to Brigham Young, Hosea Stout described the missionaries' precarious political situation. Quote, the foreigners in Shanghai have formed themselves into an armed neutrality to be ready for the worst, not knowing what may happen. There's a great deal of excitement in all of the trading posts. The troops here are held in readiness to act as the occasion requires. End of quote. Even though American warships had arrived in the East China Sea, the missionary from Utah judged China in, quote, a state of excitement, very unsafe to penetrate to the interior, end of quote. The same went for foreign settlement ports dotting the East China Sea. To make matters worse, Hong Kong's natural climate added to the elders' discouragement. Unaccustomed to sticky humidity here in Utah, scorching temperatures and heavy rains, the elders found it difficult to hold outdoor meetings there in Hong Kong. It took only about 6 weeks for the Hong Kong elders to give up any hope for future success among the Chinese residents or the British expatriates. On May 16, 1853, Hosea Stout and his companions wrote a letter to faraway Brigham Young here in Pioneer, Utah, about their experiences and sought advice. Quote, do not feel that we are discouraged or downcast, for we only want the proper element to act on to ensure success, they wrote. The people are remarkably friendly and courteous, but care nothing for our religion or missionary activities. We long to hear from you and to receive comfort and counsel, end of quote. but they knew that they would not receive any response from Pioneer, Utah at that time due to the primitive state of Pioneer mail to and from Utah. By early June, just after the elders had lost faith of any missionary success in Hong Kong, Hosea Stout wrote in his diary, quote, "Paul-like, we can truly say that the Spirit speaketh expressly, that we preach the gospel no more in Asia for the present," is how he lamented in his diary, paraphrasing the Apostle Paul's words as found in Acts 16:6. The elders planned to return to Utah, where they hoped to await the orders of the First Presidency and, quote, "the dictates of the Holy Spirit, to yet learn by what means the Lord will open to introduce the gospel successfully in this benighted land." So we can appreciate there were a number of factors that I go into much more detail, including the way they went about their evangelistic errand to the Chinese there, and the Taiping rebellion that made the situation so precarious. The elders were quite concerned not having much money and worried that they'd be stranded in Hong Kong, so while they still had money, they boarded a ship and traveled back. This is how James Lewis concluded in a note to Apostle George A. Smith, who was then living in Parowan. He lamented their lack of poverty and financial stability. He said, "The servants of the Lord were despised, their company not desired, and their doctrine unheeded even by the lowest caste of the English and American population in Hong Kong." Now, one of the things that I find interesting and why I thought this paper would be appropriate for this particular conference, number one, Juanita Brooks, of course, was the one that edited these diaries the first time in the 1960s. And so it becomes part of Juanita Brooks' story as she told it through his personal writings. Second, Hosea Stout lived here later in life after he returned from China. And as I was looking for additional materials, including correspondence and additional reminiscent accounts and reports on what had happened in China, I learned that his final report and kind of last word on this early China mission was written from right here in St. George, about a block from where we're at in his home. Even long after the China mission was long past, it remained an important part of Stout's life. In August 1865, while he was residing here in St. George, he was contacted by Robert Campbell, a staff member from the church historian's office in Salt Lake City. Campbell had reached out to staff on behalf of church leaders who sought more documentation on the early Latter-day Saint missionary forays abroad, which began with Brigham Young's call to so many missionaries in the August 1852 special conference. But by this time, Stout and his companions had been back in Utah, home from Hong Kong about a dozen years, and their recollections were not quite as fresh as they once were. Perhaps assuming that Campbell was aware of the genesis of his evangelistic service in August 1852 and his earlier than anticipated return from Hong Kong to San Francisco in August 1853, Stout said nothing about his time in China, instead focusing his letter on the subsequent close of his missionary tenure. Quote, "Upon our arrival in San Francisco, we deemed it best for one of our members to return home to report how we found things and ask counsel as how and what we should do next, and it was thought best for me to come. This was partly in consideration of my home affairs," he wrote. We learned, as he wrote later or earlier in his diary, we learned for the first time on arriving in San Francisco that my wife, Louisa, had been dead some 8 months, and my children left with no sufficient provision for their care and support. This is what he discovered after returning from Hong Kong there at the docks in San Francisco, that the entire time he'd been in Asia, his wife here in Utah had given birth and had died shortly thereafter along with her newborn baby, which is a heartbreaking story in and of itself. Stout then described the journey back to Utah, where he gave Brigham Young a report on his mission and then discussed his later experiences in the Utah Territory. He concluded his letter with a tragic line, but betrayed no bitterness about his mission or his church leader. Quote, he says, "This is, I believe, about as near as I can relate the facts in this case of his China mission. Whether there is a, quote, a come out or not to it, or whether President Brigham Young was satisfied with us, I never knew." End of quote. For over a decade, now living in St. George, Utah, Stout had wondered if the president of his church was pleased with his performance or had found him wanting. This would be his final written reminiscence of his China mission that has survived. And so in conclusion, this is just one world that Hosea Stout inhabited in 1852 and 1853. This was part of the frontier mission that he went through on part of the southern route, leaving Parowan. There was no St. George, of course, at that time in 1852, traveling on to the springs of Las Vegas and down across the Mojave Desert, where they really struggled, and then getting to the Pacific Ocean. In fact, one of my favorite parts of Stout's diary that Juanita initially published was talking about what it was like to see the Pacific Ocean for the first time in his life, and what it was like to feel that sea breeze and hear the waves crash on the shore. So thank you for allowing me to share a little window into some things that happened here many, many years ago, and to Juanita Brooks, very grateful for her and what she did to make these diaries available for the first time. Thank you.